Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Top 10 Developments in Qualitative Evaluation Over the Last Decade. This is the latest in our new Sage Talk series. My name is Nicole Elliott, and I'm the Executive Marketing Manager for Research Methods, Statistics, and Evaluation titles at Sage. And joining me today is renowned author and evaluator Michael Quinn Patton. Michael is an independent consultant with more than 40 years' experience conducting applied research and program evaluations. He was on the faculty for the University of Minnesota for 18 years, including 5 years as Director of the Minnesota Center for Social Research. Michael has authored several Sage books, including the eagerly awaited 4th edition of Qualitative Research and Evaluation Methods, as well as Utilization-Focused Evaluation. Many of you also know Michael as a former president of the American Evaluation Association and recipient of several of that association's prestigious awards. Michael is on the faculty of the Evaluators Institute and teaches workshops for the AEA's professional development courses and Claremont University's Summer Institute. He's a founding trainer for the International Program for Development Evaluation Training, sponsored by the World Bank and other international development agencies each summer in Ottawa, Ohio. Before we get started, I did want to let you know that this one-hour webinar will be recorded and will be archived for future viewing. We'll be sending out the link to view it to all registrants via email after the event, and we'll also be sending out a post-webinar survey to get your feedback about what you thought of the webinar and what you'd like to see in future webinars. Please do take a moment to complete that survey when it comes to you, as we greatly value your feedback. At the end of the webinar, we will have some time for Q&A from attendees, so please use the Q&A box to ask any questions to Michael throughout the webinar. Please also take note of the webinar hashtag, SageTalks, all one word, and feel free to tweet out any questions or comments throughout the webinar to @Sage_methods. And in addition, at the end of the webinar, if you're interested in purchasing any of Michael's books at a 20% discount, please use discount code PATTON20, PATTON20, on our website during checkout. Again, that's PATTON20. And during our time today, we will explore the recent developments in qualitative evaluation and look at the applied social science research and program evaluation tactics that Michael's crafted over the years and how we can use these fundamental building blocks today and in the future. So without further ado, let me turn the mic over to Michael.
Thank you, Nicole, and my thanks to all of the folks in Sage Marketing for the inauguration of Sage Talks and this opportunity to support our books with additional uses of media. This is an important development, very much in keeping with the times. As you'll see here in a moment, relates to one of the top 10 developments in qualitative evaluation. But let me begin by setting the context for this. I did the first edition of Qualitative Evaluation Methods in 1980, when there were virtually no qualitative methods books, and Sage was a relatively new publisher. That led to a primer on qualitative methods that was part of the Evaluator's Toolkit in 1987, and subsequently to the second edition of Qualitative Evaluation and Research Methods in 1990, a third edition in 2002. And so this newest edition that has just been published is the 4th edition, and the amount of change in the field in every 10 years is simply astounding. I actually begin each revision thinking it's just going to be a matter of updating references, but as I dig into the many files, the journals, the reports that have been sent to me, the conferences that I've attended over a period of a decade between revisions, I'm simply awestruck by how much has been developing in the field of qualitative inquiry during that period of time. And that is more true than ever for this latest edition, which is substantially larger and with many more examples because the field has developed so much. And so it's on that basis that I have identified the top 10 developments in qualitative evaluation, including conferring with colleagues in qualitative evaluation who've had input into this list. And so with that, we're going to start the countdown with number 10, powerful qualitative software. there have been major developments in qualitative analysis software and data management software over the last decade. Here you see some of the books that SAGE publishes in support of qualitative software. But the confusion I find endures around software is people thinking that it actually analyzes qualitative data. Qualitative software is a data management tool. It helps you retrieve quotations, it helps you retrieve observations, it helps you code cases, but the human being still has to do the analysis. The human being still has to decide what codes to apply. And over time, the various kinds of software have a common set of major characteristics. They began as quite different. Those of you who've lived through various word processing packages or statistical packages know that over time, software tends to converge around key elements that consumers want. And that's certainly been true of qualitative software. It is powerful. It can deal with much larger databases. It can help multiple analysts, whether they're together or at a distance, look at the same data and analyze it. It's great for teamwork, but the key point to take away here is that the qualitative analysis is still a human process, one of creativity and rigor to make sense out of the data. Number 9 on our countdown list is social media as data, both for data collection and for sharing findings. A decade ago, social media didn't exist, and it's really become such a prominent part of the landscape. People especially are liking to use it for qualitative data collection because one of the biggest costs and time factors in qualitative analysis is entering the data, transcription. And with most forms of social media, the data are already entered in. It's creating challenges of how to sample, of how to engage people in different kinds of social media, and I expect it to become more and more important as we go forward, as we use the internet, as we use web resources, as we use social media, both for data gathering and then for sharing findings. Number 8 coming up, first a Facebook cartoon, complexity concepts are catching on. Under relationship status, Facebook just added dynamical as an option. Dynamical is a complexity concept that things change and go up and down, and this is a reminder that one of the values of some of the social media, especially things like Facebook and other places where people log in and add data over time, is it gives us a way of tracking the developments and changes in people's situations and in group situations over time, which is very hard to do with most qualitative interviewing and fieldwork. So now, number 8, ethical challenges in qualitative analysis and data collection, and institutional review board constraints. IRB stands for Institutional Review Board Constraints. Institutional review boards are primarily made up of people trained in traditional social science approaches, especially quantitative methods, survey methods. And so I get lots of inquiries about how IRBs can deal with the particular nuances and strategies of qualitative inquiry, how to anticipate the impact on small numbers of participants of actually going through qualitative data, confidentiality with small sample sizes, ways of dealing with that, appropriate compensation. It's not like filling out a survey. We're often asking for 1 hour, 2 hours, multiple days of people's time. How does compensation get handled in those situations? And therefore, the difficulty of IRBs keeping up with new developments in qualitative inquiry, like the use of social media, and the ways in which data collection can, because of its intensity, one of the trends you'll see here has an effect upon people. This cartoon has a couple of lovers in bed, and she's saying, I know your study is important, I'm just not ready to commit to being your case. Case selection, identifying cases, changing the identifying characteristics of cases. All of these are ethical challenges about how to be true to the data and also deal with issues of confidentiality and ethics, small sample sizes, and compensation. Number 7 is a very big development, mixed methods. Here again, you see a number of SAGE publications on mixed methods, and the Journal of Mixed Methods Research, which has just appeared in the last decade, has the handbook of mixed methods. Mixed methods is the effort to use both quantitative and qualitative data in studies, and while there is a great deal of attention in mixed methods, the actual integration of qualitative and quantitative methods lags behind. Much of what passes for mixed methods is like two toddlers, two 2-year-olds playing together in a sandbox. Each is aware of the other's presence. They like being in the same sandbox, but they haven't developed yet the capacity to actually interact. So I see a lot of mixed methods reports that have a qualitative section and a quantitative section, but isn't really integrated. They're often asking different questions in the qualitative and quantitative section. And so while there is more attention to incorporating both quantitative and qualitative data in mixed methods, we are still just learning how to genuinely integrate mixed methods to give us deeper insights into the various facets of the questions into which we are inquiring. One of the great pioneers in evaluation, Dr. Carol Weiss, who we lost in January of 2013, in the paradigms debates between qualitative and quantitative methods that characterized much of the 70s and 80s, was one of the pioneers in recognizing that trying to say that one kind of method was better than the other was what she called, in technical jargon, silly. And she was one of the early visionaries that evaluation needed to embrace both qualitative and quantitative methods, understanding that each has strengths, each has weaknesses, and that the real challenge would be to integrate different kinds of data together. So a major trend as we go forward is in seriously engaging with the strengths and weaknesses of methods and integrating them. But here we see from AEA topical interest group memberships a huge growth in mixed methods memberships from not even having a topical interest group in 2003 to the mixed methods topical interest group in the American Evaluation Association is now equal in size to both the qualitative and quantitative methods groups. The 6th major trend is data visualization. This has become huge at the recent American Evaluation Association meeting in Denver. The biggest attended sessions were on data visualization. They were hugely popular. And this has become a major form of qualitative data. I'm going to take you through just a very quick example to give you a feel for what we're talking about with the visualization of the implementation of the Vietnam helmet law. Road traffic injuries have long been a leading cause of death and disability in Vietnam. 60% of fatalities occur in motorcycle riders and passengers. Vietnam has had a partial motorcycle helmet legislation since 1995, but with limited implementation and enforcement. So on December 15, 2007, Vietnam implemented a comprehensive mandatory helmet law with enforcement. A group of evaluators took photographs on street corners in Ho Chi Minh City, but the day before and the day after the helmet law went into effect. These are photographs on December 14, 2007. Notice the large amount of traffic, the helmets being for sale, billboards announcing the new helmet law, but people not wearing helmets. And then we get to the 15th of December, 2007, and look at the street corners. And it is very clear, dramatically clear, that this law is being implemented on a wide scale. The Asia Injury Prevention Foundation reported that nearly 100% of Vietnam's motorbike users left home wearing a helmet. They've been following up the accident reduction since that time, but the visual data are dramatic in showing the change from before and after. And we're finding more and more visualization opportunities because the technology makes it possible, because a picture is worth 1,000 words, and that's a huge trend in qualitative data analysis and presentations. Number 5, development and evaluation methods are being driven more by evaluation practice and users' demands than by theoretical orientations. In much of qualitative research in the social sciences, the methods are embedded in theoretical orientations, phenomenology, hermeneutics, symbolic interaction, and constructivism. But in evaluation, with its pragmatic emphasis, the developments in qualitative methods are driven primarily by pragmatism. They're driven by tight timelines. They're large multi-site studies. They're driven by speed. And this has both upsides and downsides as we develop more methods. Part of what it seems to me has happened is that as we've become more pragmatic, and here's a cartoon saying that Ernie decided it was time to leave the university. He wanted to be pragmatic, not discuss pragmatism. That what's happening is that the dominant form of qualitative inquiry and evaluation is interviewing. Good, solid field work, high-quality site visits are underutilized compared to the domination of interviewing, and part of that is driven by short timelines, by trying to get larger sample sizes, and so the large extent to which interviewing is being used is a mixed blessing, as we're driven by the pragmatics of short timelines and mixing qualitative data with quantitative data. A fourth major trend is qualitative evaluation as an intervention, what I've called process use, the way in which the data gathering process itself has an impact. And this is much more true of qualitative data than is of quantitative data. When we take people through an in-depth interview experience, when we go out and interact with people in the field, the interviewing process, the interactions have an impact even before data are analyzed. And we have a number of qualitative evaluation approaches that make evaluation data collection part of the intervention and typically include qualitative data as a part of that. Participatory forms of evaluation, feminist evaluation, empowerment, collaborative, transformative, developmental evaluation, interactive evaluation. These are all approaches where evaluation is not just collecting data, but in fact are engaging with the people who are providing data, building their capacity to collect and make sense of their own data so that the data collection, analysis, and reporting processes become an intervention even before and in conjunction with the findings being used and reported for bringing about improvements and developments and decisions in programs. Number 3, our increasing understanding and valuing of context, deep contextual understanding. Realist evaluation emphasizes the importance of context, and especially in Europe is being widely used. This is the cover of a journal called Emergence, which has an article on contextual intelligence as a critical competence. The American Evaluation Association conference a couple years ago had as its theme context when Deb Rogg was AEA president. And context is one of the strengths, attention to context, capturing context, describing context, understanding context is one of the key contributions of qualitative inquiry. And I want to give you some examples of the importance of this, I think one of the fundamental issues about how the world has changed is whether the theory of change is a top-down dissemination of so-called proven best practice models based upon randomized controlled trials, or in a bottoms-up contextual qualitative adaptation approach. The latter is the difference between evidence-based models, which are recipe-like, versus evidence-based principles, which are qualitative and require contextual interpretation. Basically, the principles approach emphasizes that context matters. I was part of evaluating the evaluation of the Paris Declaration on International Aid, in which the countries of the world, both donor countries and beneficiary countries, adopted 5 principles for changing how international development aid is done. Increased country ownership, alignment of donor and recipient agendas, harmonization among donors, mutual accountability, and managing for results. The evaluation of the Paris Declaration principles involved in-depth case studies with 22 countries and 18 donor agencies. And the overall finding of the evaluation of these case studies was how important context was. The contextual understanding was critical to understanding how the Paris Declaration principles were being implemented, how they were being observed, what kind of impact they were having, and that if you didn't have rich, deep contextual data and understanding, you couldn't make sense of what those principles meant in the context in which they were being implemented. I've recently been working with colleagues on evaluating principles in homelessness agencies, the principles for their working with homeless youth, a principles approach versus a recipe kind of approach. And here again, the way that we get at evaluating principles as a unit of analysis, as a new evaluand, is by doing case studies, studying what happens to those principles in practice, both youth, critical incidences, agencies, as multi-layered, nested case studies, so that the attention and appreciation of context and variations in context is one of the major contributions of qualitative inquiry, and is one of the issues that has implications more generally for how we think about the way the world has changed. Number 2, as we count down, continues to be, I think, a deeper understanding of the qualitative evaluator as the instrument. This slide shows a picture of Bob Stake, one of the qualitative pioneers, who's written about the way in which we as evaluators bring our own perspectives and values to bear in field work. On the right is former AEA President Rodney Hobson, who's written about the importance of language and culture in cross-cultural work. And what both of these things illustrate in combination with the prior point about context is that context matters and who the qualitative evaluator is matters. The experience, the expertise, the cultural competence of the evaluator. This is not an approach. Qualitative inquiry is not a set of procedures that can be done without attention to who is doing them. And that is an issue of debate. There are approaches trying to minimize the influence of the individual, of the inquirer, of the person engaged in the work. But my overall sense is that in qualitative inquiry more generally, we are appreciating increasingly the extent to which who does this work matters, and why then it's so important to have opportunities to build the capacity of people who do qualitative evaluation so that they're competent to do the work and do it in a high quality way. And now we get to number 1. Drum roll, please, as we turn to the topmost trend in my own experience in looking at what's been going on and in major developments in qualitative evaluation. The number 1 trend from where I sit and look at the world, this is one more slide on the personal factor, a quote from the Waylon Jennings song, "Old age and treachery always overcomes youth and skill." Now the drum roll, sorry about that. Number one is increased purposeful sampling options. In the end, in any kind of inquiry, what we have something to say about is what we sample, is what we study, is how we select cases. And in the third edition of the Qualitative Research and Evaluation book that came out in 2002, I had listed 16 different kinds of purposeful sampling. The new edition has 40 different kinds of purposeful sampling. More nuanced, more directed. For example, one of the new purposeful sampling approaches is sampling principles, identifying principles as a unit of analysis for the first time. So that the greater options, the greater sophistication about the ways in which how we choose cases, the multiple ways of choosing cases, having studies that combine ways of choosing cases becomes really important. And you'll notice here that I'm using and prefer the term purposeful sampling instead of what's used in other qualitative research settings as purposive sampling. And in the book, I discuss the way in which the term purposive actually originated as a quantitative term. It's a jargon term that from an evaluation perspective, it's not a term that people recognize. It's not a word that anybody uses in ordinary conversation. And because of the utilization focused and the pragmatic approach of evaluation and working with stakeholders, from the very first edition of the book in 1980, I have preferred the term purposeful, which means we sample with a purpose. We sample information-rich cases, and I find that clients and stakeholders understand what that means and why it means. Now, there are folks that prefer not to use the word sampling at all and simply to talk about case selection because the word sampling evokes probability sampling, statistical sampling. Others want to say, well, we really are still sampling, and it's a purposeful approach to sampling. So I'm going to share with you here a bit that I wrote about this from the book that enters into this debate with apologies to William Shakespeare's Hamlet, probably the most parodied passage in literature, about this issue of what to call what we do with cases. And it goes like this: to sample or not to sample, but to select cases. That is the question. Whether 'tis nobler into mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outraged statisticians for whom sampling is only and ever will be random sampling to generalize to a population, or to take arms against the purists and by opposing them to sample purposefully. Yes, to dare use the word sample, or to sample no more and by a phrase to say we end debate and talk only of case selection, purposeful case selection. Yes, selecting cases for a specified purpose, but not to sample, forswearing that word and the debates that ensue, the heartache and thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to. 'Tis a resolution devoutly to be wished, to sample, to select cases, to get on with data collection. Aye, there's the rub. For in whatever inquiry may come, when we have shuffled off this language contention, must give us pause and focus. There's the respect for the people interviewed and observed, not subjects, nor cases, nor a sample, but people with stories and lives that make calamity of so long life. For who would bear the whips and scorns of time, the oppressor's wrong, the proud man's contumely, the pangs of ineffective programs, the policy implementation's delay, the insolence of numbers only, devoid of storied life? So call it a sample or case selection. It matters not to those whose worlds we seek to enter, but make it purposeful, whatever it be called. Serve that specified purpose with intention and forethought. Fulfill that purpose with rigor and resolve. To grunt and swear and sweat under a worthy quest, to discover what is not known, to understand with depth and illumination the undiscovered country that puzzles the will and makes us rather bear those wills we have. For enterprises of great pitch and moment, With this regard, our debates turn awry and lose the name of truth in lieu of action. Soft you now into the fray of inquiry and name the thing you do, sampling or case selection, and make this choice the least of thy sins remembered. And with that, you see that there's a poll question open to ask you what your preferences are. How do you refer to and label qualitative cases chosen for inclusion in an evaluation? I'm going to ask you to complete that poll here while I continue to present, and then we'll see what the results we get here in a moment. This issue, I think, of the language is important and runs through a number of issues around qualitative inquiry as we think about how to talk about these things. I have used both kinds of language depending on the context and what the people I work with prefer. Just as I used the symbol of the gesture, whose part of the skill of the gesture was to understand how to talk to the monarch in ways that could be heard, how to communicate. And that's one of our challenges in conducting this kind of work. So the poll is ended, and we'll see where you all are here in a moment. I'm going to take just a final moment here to talk about some new directions that I think are emerging, and we'll get the poll results and turn to your questions. Looking ahead, here we've got the results. So a lot of folks, the dominant result was purposeful sampling. That's my preference. But you see people still have different kinds of preferences, and this will be an ongoing issue. So very quickly, I'm going to share 4 new directions, and we'll turn to your Q&A. First of these is, I've already referred to, how do we build the capacity for qualitative inquiry? The United Nations and the international evaluation groups have designated the year 2015 as the International Year of Evaluation, with a major focus on building capacity, including qualitative inquiry capacity. A second is getting the resources to do serious triangulated in-depth qualitative evaluations. I noted earlier, a lot of this is just going out and doing a few interviews instead of taking full advantage of high-quality in-depth fieldwork. A third is moving beyond just looking for unintended consequences to really looking at emergence, to dealing with complexity and systems thinking in our qualitative work. And I have major sections in the new book on that. And finally, we're seeing more cumulative longitudinal integration at the case and context levels. The Center for Individualized Medicine at the Mayo Clinic is helping people put together their own high-quality health records as longitudinal time series, interrupted time series designs. Every one of us is having to monitor our own cases to track our health, to track our families. And this is a practical, I think, positive future direction for the availability of data to us. So I've covered the countdown quickly. I've covered the 4 of these new directions quickly. Let's now see what's on your mind and what questions have arisen as we've talked. We've got a few minutes for looking at your questions.
We do. Thank you so much, Michael, for your information today. We've already had a few people chime in saying that the session's been very helpful for them. One of the questions we received was, I'm eager to hear about developments in theoretical approaches over the last decade, hopefully with some specific examples.
I think that the biggest developments in the theoretical issue are in systems and complexity, and to some extent in pragmatism. So that in other areas, like grounded theory, there actually have emerged some divisions about approaches to grounded theory, and some combinations of people combining grounded theory with constructivism. But the major new directions in theory that I see, and I discussed at some length, is really using systems theory as a way of both designing qualitative studies and analyzing, mapping, visualization of the data. And I'm using a lot of complexity theory in qualitative work to be able to because of the emergent nature of designs, because of the open-ended nature of qualitative inquiry, it's really very well suited for a qualitative inquiry. In work that we've been doing with some international agricultural networks and food security networks that are figuring out what they want to do and what kind of work they want to take, that highly emergent kind of programming requires a complexity-based qualitative inquiry.
That's great,
Nicole?
Thank you. Yeah, someone's asking, on slide 42, they were asking, does mixed methods apply solely to data collection methods, or does it mean mixed method evaluation too? And does the term apply to multiple modes to answer evaluation questions like observation plus focus groups plus document review?
Great question. In general, given the history, the most straightforward meaning of mixed methods has been to combine qualitative and quantitative data. What the question illustrates is that the larger issue is triangulation. Triangulation is bringing multiple kinds of data, interviews, observations, documentation data, survey data to bear on a question. So triangulation is a larger framing, in my perspective, of gathering multiple data with recognizing that any single kind of data collection has both strengths and weaknesses. And if we have multiple data collection types, we are triangulating. Mixed methods in general comes out of a tradition of trying to break through the paradigm debate and combine qualitative and quantitative. But all of these terms have to be defined in context. So there's not a single right answer to a question like that. It's how do people working within a context understand what they mean by terms like mixed methods and triangulation that fit that context.
That makes sense. You didn't mention the role of donors and donor institutions as among the top 10 developments in the last decade. Could you comment on this, please, in terms of trends in pushing certain approaches over others and also perhaps in skewing the field?
It's a very difficult thing to get a handle on. I appreciate the question because I don't see any database that actually shows what kinds of methods various donors are funding. Certainly, the overwhelming amount of money in sponsored evaluations still is going to quantitative methods and especially to randomized controlled trials. So the amount of money, in my sense, that goes to qualitative inquiry simply in volume of dollars and overall emphasis remains quite unbalanced in that regard. So it's an important question. It's something that we need to continue to track. Certainly when you look at the topical interest group membership in AEA, you see a balance of perspectives. And I think the major donors, the big foundations, are using mixed methods and valuing triangulation. But government research and evaluation still tends to be highly quantitative in what it's funding. The OMB is very quantitatively oriented, and that's going to continue to be a challenge for getting recognition for qualitative inquiry and its credibility, which was our opening polling question.
Is there a gold standard for assessing the quality of an evaluation research project regardless of theoretical framework and related methodological approaches?
No. This whole notion of gold standard is very, very nasty, very insidious. I just put out a blog post about this, and in the new book I have, in each chapter, I have indulged in what I call a rumination. I originally called them rants, but my sage editor convinced me to use the more gentle term rumination instead of rant, about issues that have annoyed me, that I've been in debate about, that I've been arguing about, that I am annoyed by, and that I try to bring some humor to bear on. So each chapter features one of those issues. And I've been posting summaries of those to the Better Evaluation blog. And one of them is about this gold standard business. The harm it does to treat something out of context as a gold standard means that you're not looking at what's appropriate. So The argument that I and others have made, like Michael Scriven, is that the gold standard needs to be replaced by what we call a platinum standard. The platinum standard is that the evaluation methods match the nature of the question, the purpose of the evaluation, the timelines, the stakeholder information needs, and that meeting the Joint Committee standards of utility, accuracy, practicality, and ethics, that's the platinum standard. That goes beyond method. Method by itself cannot be a gold standard. It has to be contextualized. And I urge people to avoid the language of gold standard. And when you hear it, knock it down, take it on. It's a distortion of how methods decisions ought to get made. Not that I feel strongly about it.
It's good to have an opinion, Michael. Quick question here. Somebody's asking, this is a good one. What academic training do you think should be an essential prerequisite for doing high-quality evaluation?
It's a great question. And the people who I know, and I've taught qualitative methods for a long time in workshops and courses, is that the challenge is that the training not just be quote unquote academic in the sense that that can imply simply classroom-based training. Qualitative methods are something you learn by doing them. And so you need to practice, you need to interview people, you need to review those interviews with other people, look at the transcripts, look at your questions, look at your answers, look at your field notes, have a support group of people who engage in this inquiry, get feedback, learn to get better at it. It's a skill set that has to be practiced. I'm still learning to do it after 40 years of doing it because context is changing, because the challenges are changing. And so the basic academic training is to understand the options, is to understand the various theoretical perspectives that inform it, to understand the epistemological and ontological assumptions that undergird qualitative inquiry. But what's really most important, I know very good qualitative evaluators who don't have much of that academic background, but have a deep skill set to go out and talk to people, listen to people, make sense of data, make observations. That's what's key.
Okay, someone else is asking if you have any preferred qualitative analysis software programs. Do you have a preference there?
I don't. I find that they've become more common. What I hear from people and what the research seems to show is that people prefer whatever program they first learned on because the learning curve is steep, and that to figure out how to do a particular software and to use it well does take a lot of work and practice. Some of it depends upon how much you're using it with other people, how big your data set are. There are some excellent review sites that compare qualitative software. If you simply Google compare qualitative analysis software, it will take you to some up-to-date websites where people are entering in their preferences and their experiences with different kinds of software. So I don't advocate one over the other. I tend to use whatever the people I'm working with are using.
I'm trying to remember back on your slides here. What was your number 4 topic on your countdown, Michael? Because someone's asking if action research would be considered as part of that development.
I believe that was the way in which qualitative inquiry is an intervention. And yes, I would include action research as an example of that organizational development that actually includes inquiry, reflective practice approaches. I didn't mean that to be a definitive list of kinds of qualitative inquiry that's an intervention. It was meant to simply be a suggestive list. So virtually any approach that involves the people in the setting in gathering and analyzing the data, as action research does, means that the qualitative inquiry is also part of the intervention.
Okay, we have another question, or a comment and a question here. I'm wondering whether qualitative evaluation is being somewhat better valued in the context of development aid, where participatory empowerment approaches seem more welcome than in the countries where evaluation is rather driven by new public management.
Well, it's certainly the case that there are places where that's being done. But it's also the case that the big international agencies, the World Bank, USAID, that's only a very small part of what they're doing. The performance measurement stuff is still dominant. The traditional bean counting stuff is still dominant. And so, as your comment and question suggests, there are pockets where participatory approaches to evaluation are being widely used. There are places in Latin America that are working out of the Pablo Freire tradition, using participatory methods, places in Africa and Asia, but they're pockets. They're not the overall approach. And unfortunately, I think they remain the exception to the rule, where the dominant institutional sort of approach remains a fairly structured, standardized, top-down, quantitative way of doing evaluation.
We have a few questions here centered around phenomenology, and I'm wondering if you can speak to any trends that you see emerging there or anything you'd like to add.
Great question. It almost became one of my rants, but in the end, it got supplanted by some other favorites. But phenomenology, the first trend is the word is being widely used by people who don't have any idea what it is. And it's one of these words like complexity, like systems, that's getting bandied about all over the place without much fidelity to it. The book has a couple of sidebars of people deeply immersed in the philosophy and epistemology of phenomenology, lamenting the way in which the term is getting to be used in some places as equivalent to qualitative inquiry, that people say, well, I'm doing a phenomenological study, and what they really mean is I'm doing a qualitative study. And so there are particular kinds of philosophical and epistemological assumptions that are embedded in really doing phenomenology. It's getting at the essence of a lived experience of some phenomenon. And so one of the cases I make in a stronger way in the new edition of the book is that we ought to be able to talk about being engaged in generic qualitative inquiry that isn't tied to one of the traditional theoretical approaches, like phenomenology or hermeneutics or symbolic interaction. That generic qualitative inquiry means that we simply pragmatically want to understand people's worldview, what their responses are to a program, do case studies on what's happened to them in the program, and that can be done pragmatically as a generic qualitative approach without tying it to one of these other traditions. So the effort I see a lot of times in qualitative evaluations to say I took a phenomenological approach, more often than not, they didn't take a phenomenological approach. So we need to be careful about what these kinds of terms mean. There are a number of different kinds of phenomenology. And so sorting out which sub-kind of phenomenology one is invested in, if you're really dealing with people engaged in phenomenology, they don't just want to know that you're a phenomenologist, they want to know what kind of phenomenologist are you. Existential, hermeneutic, heuristic, there are all kinds, realist approaches to phenomenology that are getting combined. And so it's become an area where there's subdivisions, nuances of meaning, but it's not all qualitative inquiry. That's the beginning point I would emphasize.
I wonder about quality criteria for qualitative evaluation. What are indispensable quality criteria for that, in your view, Michael?
Great question. And in fact, the final chapter addresses that question and has a list of 10 generic qualitative inquiry criteria for high quality qualitative inquiry generically. And then I argue that there are particular stakeholders and particular evaluations that will operate with other sets of criteria that are specialized, so that there are people operating using qualitative data and mixed methods primarily from a quantitative perspective. There are a distinct set of constructivist criteria, what constitutes high-quality constructivist evaluation. There are people now dealing with artistic visualization kinds of approaches that have a set of aesthetic criteria. There are particular criteria for high-quality participatory evaluations that use qualitative methods. Critical change kind of criteria where evaluation is explicitly part of the intervention. Utilization-focused evaluations that use qualitative inquiry. So there are nested criteria within the overall generic criteria. The generic criteria include, I'll just take time to give a couple of examples. First of all is the competence, qualifications, and experience of the person or people or team doing the work. You noted that the second in the item in the top 10 list was that who does qualitative inquiry still matters. So high quality qualitative work needs to not only discuss the methods in the methods section, but the background, competence, and experience and qualifications of the person doing the work. A second criterion that relates to the number 1 on the top 10 list is it's clear how the purposeful sampling was done, how information-rich cases were selected. I find a lot of sloppiness, even more so now that social media are getting used more, about exactly how cases were selected. And one of my rants/ruminations is that convenience sampling is not purposeful sampling. I made the mistake in the last edition of the book in my list of purposeful sampling options of listing as number 16 convenience sampling, which I then went on to say, but this is not really information-rich or purposeful sampling and should not be considered as such. But because I gave it a number and included it in the table, I see qualitative evaluation reports that say we're using Patton's number 16 approach to sampling. So in the new book, I've taken out convenience sampling and have a rumination on how convenience sampling is not purposeful, it's lazy, it's not really appropriate for high quality work, and that knowing and discussing the implications of how you picked cases becomes really important. The third one I'll mention quickly is being clear about the perspective brought to bear in analysis, having a balanced analysis, looking for disconfirming cases, really being true to the data, being rigorous about how you are engaged in the analysis and what different perspectives might give you different kinds of meaning making out of the analysis.
Michael, someone's asking how well can longitudinal evaluation be used in evaluation?
Longitudinal evaluation can be quite powerful because it gets beyond the pre-post kind of nature of a lot of quantitative data collection to actually capture things not only at the beginning and at some endpoint, but along the way, to capture process, to capture ups and downs, to capture the dynamics of a program and of participation in a program. So longitudinal qualitative evaluation is one of the most powerful kinds of case studies.
Okay, and what would you say about student voice projects or how we can find ways to incorporate the voices of individuals who have typically been marginalized and their ability to give their perspectives, such as you gave about homelessness? My interest is in students with disabilities, LGBTQ, immigrant, and student populations.
It's a really important question, and there is a form of evaluation called inclusive evaluation and another called multivocal evaluation, which especially emphasizes being sure to include marginalized populations in evaluation. And the main wisdom that comes out of that kind of work is to engage the people who you're anxious to include in how best to include them. clearly the examples that you give, people with disabilities, LGBT people, immigrants, create different kinds of challenges. And so what I advise is to actually do a form of participatory qualitative evaluation and ask the people you want to include how best to include them, safely, genuinely, and authentically.
Do you talk about generic qualitative approaches in the book? If you do, maybe you could elaborate on which ones.
Yes, the latest book, in fact, has the first major section on generic qualitative inquiry. It's in Module 18. The new book is organized by modules for the first time to make it easier to break into parts because the chapters are long. And pages 152 to 155 in the new book discusses generic qualitative inquiry, which is basically asking straightforward questions to get straightforward answers without framing the inquiry within one of the traditional theoretical traditions like phenomenology, hermeneutics, ethnography, etc. So yes, you'll find a discussion and references in the new edition of the book.
That's great, thank you. Michael, where would you say autoethnography fits into this idea of paying more attention to the qualitative evaluator as an instrument?
It's another great question because it involves connecting some things that aren't usually connected. And the main way in which autoethnography, a version of autoethnography, not the full piece, comes in play in evaluation is around the idea of reflexivity, of being aware of who you are as the instrument, your background, your perspectives, your training, how that affects you. This is particularly germane for participant observation evaluation. Some of the most exciting and meaningful and certainly in-depth evaluations I've done have included participant observation evaluation, and part of my report was autoethnographic in that I described my own experience of the program culture as I went through the program.
That's really interesting. I'm wondering, have you ruminated at all about snowball sampling in the book?
Well, I appreciate that question because the ruminations are the things that have annoyed me and that I find problematic. So as I noted, I have ruminated about convenient sampling, but snowball sampling is actually quite an important and legitimate form of purposeful sampling that involves asking people who else you should talk to get different perspectives. And so I haven't ruminated about it in the sense that I've discussed my annoyance with it, but I discuss it at length in Chapter 5 of the book on qualitative design. It is one of the major kinds of purposeful sampling, as well as some new versions of it. Respondent-driven sampling is a new form of snowball sampling that involves actually recruiting people in a program to help you recruit other participants into the study.
You've referred to the continuing predominance of quantitative evaluation. Is the balance between quantitative versus qualitative increasing, and what steps or factors would speed up that balance?
Well, I wish it was increasing. I think that more and more our world remains in a quantitative mania. The seduction of numbers, the expectation of numbers, and the short attention span that numbers feed. Qualitative inquiry takes some time. You have to engage with the data. You have to think about it. It doesn't, I've got an exhibit in the book that even compares PowerPoint bullets to actual qualitative patterns and more depth of data. So the thing that would speed up the balance is creating space where people are genuinely willing to engage data. This is a big part of utilization-focused evaluation that I write about, is negotiating from the beginning of an evaluation the time with people who are going to use the findings to actually engage in some depth with the data. And that means engaging both in the qualitative and quantitative data, what each shows you separately, and engaging in that integration of the data. Negotiating, getting the expectations, setting a norm for spending time with the data.
Another question here. I utilize the HUDAS and, did I say that right, HUDAS? HUDAS? Okay, and cultural formulation interview for evaluator and participant, and keeping a notebook for the duration of the research project, keeping the interviewer in check, evaluating competency. Any suggestions on other cultural competency assessment measures?
Well, cultural competency is one of the major developments of the last decade, and indeed I subsumed it under the importance of the evaluator as instrument rather than treating it as a separate trend, although I was tempted to do so. And as you may well know, the American Evaluation Association just this past year adopted cultural competency guidelines and standards that include the kind of competence that evaluators need to be culturally competent. My main suggestion is, rather than looking for any kind of generalizable context-free suggestions, that cultural competency by its very nature means that whatever ways we gather data need to be appropriate to context. That's the overall criteria, is that we take context seriously and adapt our measures, both quantitative and our inquiry qualitative, to the cultural context, and that includes the qualitative inquirer, and that the qualitative inquirer's competence to engage in a particular context or multiple contexts.
You know, we touched a little bit on what academic requirements you felt were necessary for doing good evaluation, but can you speak a bit to the non-academic training that you think would be helpful?
The big part of that within an overall competency framework of essential competencies for evaluation that also has been worked on in the last decade are the interpersonal relationships, how to facilitate group processes, how to hear people of different backgrounds, how to interact with them respectfully, how to present yourself in a way that communicates empathy. The whole interpersonal dimension of evaluation is clearly important, both for data collection, but for all aspects of the evaluation design, engagement of stakeholders along the way, and in reporting. And so interpersonal communications, conflict resolution, being able to facilitate, these are key non-academic kinds of skills that are critical to doing interactive forms of evaluation and qualitative data collection.
Probably good advice for all of us, actually. Can you comment just a little bit on the most important validity issues that may be opening up more receptivity to qualitative research contributions?
Another great question that's discussed at length, especially in the last chapter of the book, on the credibility issues around qualitative inquiry. And indeed, many qualitative inquirers prefer not to use the word validity because it's associated with quantitative and statistical techniques, and instead talk about trustworthiness of the data and the authenticity of the data. But the overall approach here is to think about who the audience is for a particular evaluation and what their criteria are going to be for judging the quality and excellence of any particular qualitative inquiry. In the final chapter of the book, I examine 7 different frameworks that lead to different judgments of quality. So, for example, if your audience are traditional social scientists who come with those values and those concepts, they will expect one to address validity in qualitative inquiry, whereas constructivist audiences who are into social construction and constructivism would expect to deal with trustworthiness. People involved in participatory evaluation are going to judge validity by the quality of participation that the evaluator facilitates. And utilization-focused evaluators will judge validity by the extent to which the results are pragmatic enough to actually help improve programs. So validity turns out to be contextual in evaluation and in qualitative inquiry. It's not one definition fits all. It's contextual.
That makes sense. You mentioned challenges with the IRBs and getting qualitative research accepted. How do we move forward with this, especially in areas that are still very quantitatively focused?
It's a really important question. And again, it varies by university, it varies by institutional review board. And I think that part of it is, as a profession, both evaluation and qualitative fields more generally, the social sciences, sociology, psychology, political science, economics, all of which you have to engage with IRBs, is that we advocate that IRBs be sure to include people with qualitative backgrounds who know about qualitative methods, who can bring to bear the particular issues that affect ethics when doing qualitative research. And that's not currently an expectation for a lot of IRBs. Some of them have gone that direction. And I think that we need to push a mixed methods perspective in IRBs to be sure that there are people who can deal with a variety of approaches.
Is this notion of triangulation and mixed methods by simply tacking on additional modes of data not a positivist view which portends to confer validity? Maybe you could just distinguish for us the difference between using multiple methods and triangulation.
Well, it's a great question, because multiple methods just means, in some cases in evaluation, different kinds of methods answer different questions. So surveys are better to reach a large population of people and to come up with more generalizable results. Qualitative cases are better to get in-depth understanding of particular people in a program or different kinds of experiences in programs. And so that's simply mixed methods. That's simply using different methods to answer different questions. And triangulation doesn't just refer to different kinds of methods. So again, in the last chapter of the book, there is methods triangulation, which is looking at whether different methods give you the same or different answers. And the key there is to understand that the point is not simply to confirm that these different methods all point to the same truth. That's the positive view that this questionnaire is pulling out. In fact, from a constructivist point of view, we actually expect different methods may yield different results, that there are different kinds of insights generated by different kinds of data. And so to understand how different data, different methods of collection give us different insights is not to force the methods together, but to understand how methods affects finding. In addition to methodological triangulation, there's theoretical triangulation. How do you interpret data from different perspectives? There's analyst triangulation. Do different people looking at the same data come up with the same kind of results? So triangulation is simply a metaphor that suggests using different perspectives to look at the same thing. Those different perspectives can be methodological, they can be theoretical, they can be analytical in the form of the people doing the work. And they can be utilization focused, different uses of the findings from different points of view. The triangulation means looking at things in multiple ways, only one of which is mixed methods.
How do you see the evaluation world changing with the collective impact movement?
I think part of what collective impact is going to highlight is the movement from attribution analysis to contribution analysis. One of the hang-ups about a lot of evaluation is the problem of attribution. Can the program take credit for whatever changes there are? And what we know is that in large-scale efforts, international efforts, where there are multiple partners, multiple interventions, complex environments where a lot's going on, you simply can't do causal attribution. And so under those conditions, what has emerged as a very powerful counter approach to attribution is contribution analysis, sorting out and mapping the various contributions of various partners to an overall systems change. And so I think it intersects with things like systems analysis, complexity, developmental evaluation, contribution analysis, that all of these are moving us towards being able to deal with an evaluation with systems change and complexity as different units of analysis rather than the traditional very narrow focused project and program.
Michael, what do you think is the best method for normative performance evaluation?
I love this question because it is one of my ruminations. There is no best anything. Nada, nothing. Best suggests that there's something that works across every context in every situation. And so one of the ruminations in the book is called Best Practices Aren't. And so the very framing of the question is an example of how we get in trouble and the importance of questions. To begin by asking what's best takes you down the primrose path of very simplistic thinking. It's better to ask the more nuanced question, what works in what ways, for what purposes, in what conditions, under what context? That's the appropriate question. And there, the answer is, it depends.
Not cut and dry then.
Right.
Do you see a movement towards collecting and archiving the data or metadata in one of the international formats, for example, Data Documentation Initiative for evaluation, especially an evaluation that does not have a university sponsor?
I don't see a movement in that direction, primarily because the people who pay for evaluations are the ones who determine the format that they want it in. And the people who pay for evaluations, philanthropic foundations, governments, nonprofits, businesses, they don't agree on any uniform kind of documentation. They want a format that fits their own organization, fits their own reporting requirements, fits their own culture. And so far, evaluation is having to be responsive to the primary intended users, to stakeholders, to the people who pay for evaluations, and those people have to get together if they're going to create any kind of uniformity around archiving and reporting.
Can you advise on how large organizations can systematically integrate qualitative data into their performance measurement?
Well, first, let me say that I think that has huge potential. It's also very dangerous because it's so easy to do it badly. And so what it means is to look for opportunities to gather in-depth reflective data about things like critical incidences that have been a part of performance, about things like teamwork, about challenges that have been faced, and to include a more holistic, in-depth understanding of what performance challenges have been, what performance results have been, and to look at those descriptively and interpretively as a part of a more holistic picture of performance, both for individuals, for teams, and for entire program areas.
We've asked you a lot of questions about sort of the best practices, but what do you think are some of the pitfalls to avoid in a typical participatory evaluation?
Well, the primary pitfall to avoid in participatory evaluation is the lack of genuine participation, authentic participation. There's a lot of shallow participation where the evaluator remains in control. The worst example I ever saw was a World Bank report in which they called what they were doing participatory evaluation because, and this is the actual language used, they allowed people in villages for the first time to fill out a survey. Now, that's not what we typically mean by participatory evaluation. Participatory evaluation is where the people in the program are helping design the evaluation, are deciding what the important questions are involved in methodological decisions, are often involved in data collection, and are certainly involved in a genuine, authentic way in data analysis and reporting. Brad Cousins, Lynn Shula, their colleagues in Canada have been working at this for a long time, and they have come up with a set of principles for collaborative and participatory evaluation that emphasize authenticity and genuineness. There's a major section in the new book about genuine participatory evaluation that primarily does use qualitative methods because they're accessible to people. They build on the oral history of indigenous people and cultures that value oral data. And so the evaluator in those conditions has to be a skilled facilitator, not the judge, and be able to work with people in a coaching, facilitated manner. Not to do so is a huge pitfall.
I think we'll do one quick question here that's left. We have many more that I'm going to ask Michael to take some time to answer offline because you guys have lots of wonderful questions that I'm sure a lot of people would benefit from the answers to. But this one actually comes from someone who is advising graduate students. When should conceptual frameworks be used in dissertation proposals as opposed to theoretical frameworks? What is the requirement for conceptual frameworks? The issue seems to be very confusing to students and dissertation mentors.
Well, it's a great question, and it reflects the changes and developments in the field. I did my dissertation at the University of Wisconsin in the 1970s in sociology when qualitative dissertations were not acceptable, and I had to convert all of my data into numbers so that the people I worked with in the evaluation never saw the numbers. They only saw the qualitative case studies, and my doctoral committee only saw the regression analysis and never saw the qualitative data and weren't interested in it. So the issue of what's accepted is very much departmental specific, discipline specific, university specific. I don't think it's possible to give a general answer to that. What I would say is one needs to be clear. If a department and discipline requires the inquiry to be placed within a theoretical tradition, like phenomenology or hermeneutics, then that's going to have to be done. If one is allowed to do applied dissertations, including evaluations, then the conceptual framework and the evaluation approach being used would be more important than the theoretical framework, and the theoretical framework might not be a matter of emphasis at all. And so those are quite distinct ways of conceptualizing qualitative inquiry, and it very much depends upon the nature of the dissertation question, the criteria for what constitutes a dissertation, and what it takes to get a doctorate within particular disciplines and universities. Thank you all for participating in this. I will try to answer follow-up questions, but with 450 to 500 participants who actually showed up, I may simply have to say to some of the questions, refer to page such and such of the book. Thank you so much, Nicole. Thank you, Sage, for making this possible. And do note that there is a discount for getting the book. The launching price, if I may say so, of the book has been really positioned to make it accessible to people. I know from past history that that price will not endure. This book is much bigger than the past book, and the price will increase pretty quickly, I forecast, early in the year. So if you're thinking about getting the book or making it a holiday gift to hundreds of your relatives, do it sooner rather than later because this price will not endure.
I agree. It's been pulled down from the previous edition. Yeah, the previous edition was about 130. It's now at 99, and you'll get that 20% discount if you use Patton 20 during our discount. And people are asking about the title of the book, which we haven't put prominently in the presentation. It's Qualitative Research and Evaluation Methods. It's the 4th edition of that title. Thank you so much, Michael, for your time today. We really appreciate it. Okay, we'll go ahead and wrap things up. We do hope that you'll be able to join us for additional SAGE talks. We don't have any scheduled just at the moment, but we certainly will get them going again in the spring. And if you'd like to see those as they become available, you can visit sagepub.com/SageTalks for more information. Thanks so much for your attendance today, and we will send an email out with a link to this webinar and some follow-up information. Have a good day.